Hi, my name is Annalisa Ventola, and I'm the Executive Director of the Parapsychological Association. Today, I'm going to give you an introduction to parapsychology. Over the next 30 minutes, I hope to give you a broad overview of the field, as well as introducing you to some key concepts that you are likely to encounter, especially if you are attending the SSE-PA Connections Convention later this month. What is parapsychology? It is the scientific and scholarly study of unexplained aspects of human experience, and that falls along three broad categories. The first of these is extrasensory perception, which includes clairvoyance, telepathy, and precognition. Clairvoyance meaning clear seeing, clearly seeing the present. Telepathy suggests some kind of mind-to-mind interaction, and precognition, that is somehow knowing the future. Mind-matter interactions is our second category, and that includes psychokinesis, mental healing, and the power of intent. And finally, phenomena suggestive of survival of bodily death, which is a pretty broad category that includes reincarnation, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, hauntings, and apparitional experiences. A term that you're going to encounter a lot if you get to any depth in this field is the term psi. Psi is literally the 23rd alphabet of the 23rd letter of the Greek alphabet. And it was chosen as a neutral substitute for ESP-PK, or sometimes we even use it to substitute for the idea of survival. It can be used as an adjective or a noun, so we can talk about trying to find psi in an experiment, or we can talk about, for instance, how an experiment gave us a good psi result. And psi neither implies that anomalous phenomenon are paranormal, nor does it connote anything about their underlying mechanisms, and that's what's really important about the term. It can be useful to describe the anomalous outcome of a laboratory experiment without the researcher being required to choose between culturally connotated words like clairvoyance, telepathy, or psychokinesis. You might also encounter the term psi-hitting, and that means when a person scores a hit more frequently than you would expect by chance, usually in a laboratory experiment. And then there's psi-missing, which is really interesting, and that is when a participant might miss a target more frequently than would be expected by chance. Both of those are anomalous results, whether you're hitting the target more than you'd expect or missing it more than you expect. There's usually something interesting going on there. Something is called psi-conducive if it is favorable to or facilitative of the occurrence of psi. So some people might say that, like, mild sensory deprivation, for instance, is psi-conducive. And sometimes you'll hear people talking about chance guessing. They might say, oh, my experiment failed because all we got was chance guessing. That's a null result. So there are several major parapsychological research approaches. Probably the most popular and well-known would be the experimental research, which is laboratory studies of psi. But there's multiple ways to approach parapsychology, because parapsychology itself isn't really a field so much as it is a interdisciplinary field of people who are approaching the topic from multiple places. And so it's a collection of research topics that people bring their own expertise to. So scholarly research also falls into the parapsychology. So we can have discussion of philosophical issues, historical surveys. We see contributions from the humanities. Analytical research, which might mean just doing statistical analyses of large databases that other people have done experiments with. Case studies, which could be in-depth studies of personal psi experiences, field investigations, or comparisons of cross-cultural beliefs and practices that are related to psi. And theoretical research, and that would be mathematical, descriptive, and or phenomenological models of psi. Now, what is a parapsychologist? Parapsychologist is a scientist or scholar who assumes that unexplained aspects of human experience can be studied rationally and scientifically. And this is a very important point. Not everybody thinks that these topics can be researched scientifically. They might feel that they're just so wholly other that they cannot be amenable to scientific research. Some people feel that occult topics should remain occult, should remain hidden. But a parapsychologist is somebody who says we can use the tools of science to explore this. That person will either think that existing scientific models of perception and memory are already adequate to explain these experiences, or they might think that significant, or some might say revolutionary, expansions of the current state of scientific knowledge would be required to understand these experiences. A parapsychologist usually develops proficiency in an academic discipline. Like I said earlier, it's an interdisciplinary field. So we see people come to it from, a lot of times from psychology, but also anthropology, physics, mathematics, history, sociology, even linguistics. Parapsychologists also usually publish their research in a peer-reviewed scientific or scholarly journal. And finally, you'll find that parapsychologists usually maintain professional affiliations. Some of the major societies are the Society for Scientific Exploration, the Parapsychological Association, Society for Psychical Research, and then there's also a lot of more locally based ones like the Australian Institute of Parapsychology, multiple places that we can affiliate. I want to talk about the Parapsychological Association for obvious reasons. The PA has been around since 1957, where it was established in the United States, and it is affiliated with the American Association for the Advancement of Science and has been affiliated since 1969. What that affiliation gives us a seat at the Workshop of Science, because the AAAS is the largest general scientific body in the world. And then an important factor to consider is that the PA endorses no ideologies or beliefs other than the value of rigorous scientific and scholarly inquiry. The mission of the PA is to advance parapsychology as a science, to disseminate knowledge of the field, and to integrate the findings of parapsychology with those of other branches of science. To that end, we have a bulletin that we distribute to our members that it shows, news of the field, but also sometimes we like to get into topics in a way that is lay friendly. So these are some fairly recent issues of our Mind-Filled Bulletin, and one issue is on physical theories of psi. We had another one that focused on psychological theories of psi, and one on celebrating diverse methods, because like I said, there's multiple ways to approach the field. The PA also subsidizes the Journal of Parapsychology, which is published by the Rhine Research Center. It is a peer-reviewed journal, usually containing experimental research, but not always. And it is widely indexed as well. You might be surprised to find it even at your local college or university library. And then the PA also has conferences, an annual convention. The last in-person conference we had was in 2019 in Paris. The year before that, we were at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California. The year before that, we were in Athens, Greece. And then in 2016 was the last time that we combined forces with the Society for Scientific Exploration, which we did in Colorado. We do very often like to actually meet in person. That is typical for us, but alas, the global situation has us now meeting online this year. And that is a combined convention with the Society for Scientific Exploration that is taking place July 23rd through the 31st at the URL that you see below there. I'm going to take a moment to talk about the Society for Scientific Exploration. They are a professional forum for presentations, criticism, and debate concerning topics which for various reasons are ignored or studied inadequately within mainstream science. And they also like to promote improved understanding of these factors that unnecessarily limit the scope of scientific inquiry, such as sociological constraints, restrictive worldviews, hidden theoretical assumptions, and the temptation to convert prevailing theory into prevailing dogma. The SSE has a wide variety of topics, they're kind of an umbrella organization for any kind of scientific exploration that doesn't quite have a home. And so in addition to parapsychology, you'll see topics like subtle energy, currently ununderstood astronomical ideas, UFOlogy, sometimes cryptozoology, bioenergy, complementary medicine, all kinds of fascinating topics. And like the PA, they also have a lay-friendly bulletin or a magazine called Edge Science. They have a peer-reviewed journal, and they also host conventions on an annual basis. And of course, the PA is very pleased to be combining with the SSE this year to have an event that is going to be pretty broad. But you'll find that more than half of the topics of this convention are going to be on parapsychology. And so I want to get just a little bit more in depth into that field. So first, let's examine how we have studied extrasensory perception over the last few decades at least. I'm going to start with the Rhine era, roughly the 1930s to the 1960s. And one of the prevailing paradigms is something that we call forced choice testing. And that is when a participant has to choose the psi target among a number of fixed alternatives, such as a number, Zener cards, which we see over here on the left, playing cards, or colors. Zener cards were ESP testing cards named after the perceptual psychologist Carl Zener, who apparently suggested the symbols that would be used on those cards, which you can see here are a circle, a cross, some wavy lines, a square, and a star. And most of the research of this era was designed to be proof-oriented, and that was designed to determine the degree to which psi experiences can be verified using current scientific methods. This type of research got its start right around when probabilities and probability methods were being figured out in statistics. And so we very much see the growth of statistics and the growth of parapsychology side by side. In the 1970s to the 1990s, one of the prevailing research paradigms was the Ganzfeld experiment. And this was a process-oriented experiment, which was designed to learn more about the psychological, physiological, and physical mechanisms of psi. It doesn't mean that every Ganzfeld experiment was process-oriented. Some of them were very much proof-oriented. But we get the opportunity to look at some more things just besides whether psi exists or not. Another feature of this era is free response testing, where a participant gets to respond freely, reporting whatever images, memories, and feelings come to mind. And usually the targets for these type of experiments are not Zener cards, but they could be like art prints or video clips, or things that have hopefully an intense and emotional reaction. And we also started to look at research into altered states, which is any mental state that is differing from that of a normal waking condition. The Ganzfeld in particular is a special type of environment or a technique for producing it that consisted of a homogeneous, unpatterned sensory stimulation. So you can see here in this picture that this person has well, it's a little fuzzy, but there's halved ping pong balls over this person's eyes. There's a red light being shown on the face, and then with the headphones, we got white noise. And so what that's doing is it's kind of creating like a sort of an unpatterned field that allows the brain to sort of reach for more interesting stimuli. And we hope that that stimuli will be the target in an experiment. In the 1990s, we started to see more researchers looking at unconscious psi, and it doesn't mean that they stopped doing Ganzfeld experiments. In fact, at the upcoming conference, Professor Carolyn Watt's going to tell us about how the Ganzfeld is still useful even in the 2020s. But when we are dealing with this, well, several decades of research, a couple things come to mind. The previous periods were looking at explicit anomalous cognition, and that is conscious attempts by participants to produce a psi effect. In the unconscious psi, we're looking more at implicit anomalous cognition, and these are psi effects that are produced by affective and cognitive processes that are not accessible to the conscious awareness or control. And a popular thing to study during this time is presentiment, which is sort of an unconscious form of precognition. And we would see that done both with selected subjects, and so that would be study participants who are chosen because they have particular skills or traits, such as advanced meditators, or unselected subjects, and these are study participants who participate in studies either by convenience or as a representative of the general population. In these experiments, it's typical for there to first be a stimulus, and then we measure how the participant responds to it. Some examples of stimulus or stimuli: visual. It could be violent, erotic, or neutral pictures. Sometimes experiments have used light flashes as a stimuli, or auditory stimuli such as neutral and unpleasant sounds or startling sounds. And then to measure response, these studies can do a number of things, but the most common would be electrodermal activity, heart rate, blood volume, respiration, pupil dilation, blink rate, EEG measurements, or fMRI. This is how a typical trial would go. For the participant, they would just feel like they're sitting in a chair and watching a slideshow, because this stuff runs automatically and randomly. So the participant may or may not press a button, at which point there's about 5 seconds of a blank screen. Then the computer randomly chooses a photo, which can be, negative, positive, or neutral. And then that's followed by 10 seconds of blank screen, and then repeat. And so what's been interesting about this research paradigm is that this is what a typical study result might look like. We can see that, oh, my mouse works, look at that. We can see here for the emotional photos that, while looking at the photo, we see kind of a flat response because the mind is sort of taking in what they're looking at. And after, we can see for the emotional photos that there's usually a very strong response. For the calm ones, not so much. We just kind of relax a little bit. And this is, what we expect to see during a slideshow. But what's really interesting in the presentiment studies is that before the calm, or before the emotional photos, we see this little teeny bump right here. We see the body responding to a photo that hasn't even been selected yet. And this is really interesting to researchers. This is something that has been studied pretty exhaustively over the last couple of decades. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Inspired by these presentiment studies and the Ganzfeld and other currents in parapsychology, Daryl Bem published in 2011 a landmark study called Feeling of the Future: Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect. And he published it in a high-impact mainstream psychology journal, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Daryl Bem himself, he's now retired, but at the time he was a professor at Cornell University. He did 9 experiments over 1,000 subjects in 15 years of research. And out of those 9 experiments, 8 of them produced statistically significant evidence for precognition. What he did was he time reversed well-established psychological experiments so that the individual's responses were obtained before the causal stimulus events would occur. So, for example, one of the experiments was a memory test. And so in the typical mainstream paradigm, what would happen is the subject would come in, study some words, and then their memory of those words would be tested. But in the time reversed version, Ben would have people take the test first and then study the words after. And he found that sometimes they were able to know the right words even though they hadn't seen them yet. What's brilliant about these studies is that they were designed to be simple statistically and easy to replicate, and replicate we did. And so we're still talking about these studies, and you're going to see it come up at the conference about what people have done with this paradigm, whether they're doing a straight replication or they're taking some aspect of it and looking more closely at it. We're going to hear more about this at the convention. All right, so moving on to mind-matter interaction. There are two broad categories of psychokinesis, and we refer to them as macro PK and micro PK. Macro PK is manipulations of visible objects at rest. Although in spoon bending, sometimes they're being handled, but in general, we're talking about the manipulation of large objects, whereas in micro PK, we're doing manipulations of invisible processes that are in motion. And we see in the picture here, this is a Celeron device. This is an electronic device that hooks up to a computer. And what it does is it measures radioactive decay. Macro PK, it can be difficult to quantify, but micro PK is quantifiable. Macro PK is going to require exceptional subjects, or selected subjects, as we might say. But in a micro PK experiment, just about anybody can participate. In macro PK, it can be difficult to detect or prevent subject fraud, whereas micro PK is only susceptible to experimenter fraud. Some early studies of micro PK provided some interesting evidence for ordinary volunteers mentally affecting things like the fall of rolling die, which you see in one of the pictures here, or the sequence of numbers that would be produced by electronic random number generators. Following that, there was a long research program at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. And that program continued for nearly 30 years with individuals attempting to influence random processes. Following the closing of that lab, actually even before it closed, we saw as an offshoot the Global Consciousness Project. And that is an international collaboration of scientists and engineers who are using a global network of random event generators around the world. And they're testing the claim that there exists a unified field of human consciousness. And they look for evidence that thoughts, emotions, and perceptions may potentially cohere in response to major world events, producing detectable effects. And they do certainly get some interesting ones. I want to talk for a moment about meta-analysis, though, because this is something that we're going to see come up a lot also at the conference. Just real brief, meta-analysis is a statistics technique that combines like studies. And what it does is it allows researchers to identify trends in those studies, because more data creates a possibility for more patterns to emerge. And this is useful when smaller studies have been found to be contradictory or weak. But it is, subject to, sometimes subject to bias. It's a kind of a subjective enterprise sometimes. And so one of the wonderful things that has happened in the field is that there's been a lot of meta-analyses that have been published in mainstream journals. And so I have here just a handful, some fairly current ones. And if you look at the list, we got, let's see, F1000 Research, Psychological Bulletin, Frontiers in Psychology, Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine, British Journal of Psychology, and Psychological Bulletin. Meta-analyses are fantastic, but they're also kind of a source of debate. And so you may see some people arguing, or debating about, which should we have included this study in the meta-analysis or not included that study. And, in the process of science, sometimes we can get very detailed on these things. So you might see that at the conference. Finally, the survival of bodily death. And I'm just going to quickly define a few things, and then we'll talk about some more, slightly more in depth. So, survival phenomenon. It includes reincarnation. That's a form of survival in which the human soul or some aspects of self is, after the death of the body, reborn into a new body. And this process purported to be repeated through many lives. Out-of-body experiences, that's an experience either spontaneous or induced, in which one's center of consciousness seems to be in a spatial location outside of one's physical body. And then there's near-death experiences. These are experiences undergone by persons who either seem to be at the point of death, or who are even formally declared dead, but then recover, or who narrowly escape death without being seriously injured. And we find that there's kind of some core experiences around the NDEs that sort of shape that experience. And those include a feeling of indescribable peace, a sense of being out of one's body, movement into a dark void or down a tunnel, seeing a brilliant light and entering that light, panoramic memory, such as the life review, and encountering presences. Also, under the umbrella of survival research, we consider hauntings. And a haunting is a regular occurrence of anomalous phenomena associated with a particular locality and usually attributed to the activities of a discarnate entity. Some of the phenomena that we'll see at haunted houses include apparitions, object movements, cold drafts, sounds of steps and/or voices, and various odors. More generally, though, is the apparitional experience, which comes from the Latin apparere, to show oneself. And it is an experience in which there appears to be present a person, animal, object, or scene who or which is out of the sensory range of the witness. This is a little bit broader than the idea of a ghost. Apparitions do not need to happen in haunted contexts. And roughly 10% of the population has seen them, except for there's a 1947 study where it was 14%, but that's kind of roughly how that experience is distributed in the population. So apparitional experiences are very interesting, and they can be stimulated in a laboratory using something we call a psychomantium, which is Greek for theater of the mind. And so this is a darkened room with a tilted mirror and somebody in a relaxed position, pretty much scrying, which is mirror gazing. And the setup is designed to induce apparition-like experiences. It often does. It creates a controlled condition for stimulating apparitions. And for that reason, I think we see at least one study like that at the upcoming convention. We've seen that used as a tool for that kind of research. Poltergeists are tricky. The literal translation is a poltergeist is a noisy and mischievous ghost, a spirit capable of making mysterious noises. That's from Webster's dictionary. Polter derives from the verb poltern, which means rumble or to make noise or bluster, and geist means spirit, apparition, or ghost. In the field of parapsychology, though, we have some other ideas about what's going on with the poltergeist. And some people have suggested that it might be not an actual noisy ghost, but a situation of unconscious psychokinesis. In fact, the term they use is recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. And this came about because investigators started to notice that moving objects and strange noises seem to focus around a central person, who we would call often the SSE-PA agent. And these objects and noises will manifest spontaneously, but do not seem to be willfully controlled by the central person or the SSE-PA agent. So it's thought to act on an unconscious level. So finally, I just want to give you a overview of where you can find the various universities, laboratories, and societies in the field. This map is a little bit dated, but I think it still holds true. As you can see here, most of the, all these pins represent, again, a university research center or laboratory. And a lot of these pins are in Europe. And Europe is enjoying a lot of success even at the institutional level and universities as far as, teaching and studying parapsychology. If you look to the coasts of North America, you'll see a handful of centers and tiny bit in South America. But only, elsewhere in the world, there's one in Japan, one in India, one in Australia, but as you can see, things are distributed very much in Europe. So if you're interested in learning more about the field and you come from a scientific background or you're a student in the sciences, I recommend these books here, and this is An Introduction to Parapsychology by Irwin and Watt. Transcendent Mind, The Rethinking the Science of Consciousness, which was published by the American Psychological Association. And then Parapsychology, A Handbook for the 21st Century. It was published only just a few years ago, so it's really good up-to-date summaries on a lot of the things that I just discussed, but of course in way more detail. And then for the general public, two books I like. Actually, all of Dean Radin's books are excellent, but this is his most recent one, Real Magic. And then this book, The Gift by Sally Ryan Feather. It is mostly focused on people's experiences, but she organizes it in such a way too that helps us learn a little bit about the field that's studying it. So it gives a little bit about, not just the experiences, but also the researchers as well. And it's quite a nice read. And so that is pretty much it for my presentation. I would like to encourage you, of course, to come to the conference at the end of the month. That's at SSE-PA.healthyseminars.com. But also, I would like to encourage you to become a member of the Society for Scientific Exploration and/or the Parapsychological Association. Both of these organizations have a level of membership for everybody, regardless of their level of interest in the field. So if you are a professional, there's a level of membership for that. But if you're just an interested reader and you just want to get the bulletin and stay up to date on the research, there's usually some kind of associate or supporting level of membership at each organization. So thank you very much for your attention, and I can take some questions now. Okay, so that was a nice blast from the past, last year's talk, and just want to clarify that this year it still is an SSE-PA event. It is still at the same Earl, but it is taking place on June 23rd through the 26th. And that is titled Breakthrough 2022. And of course, we'll be talking about that throughout the day. So at this point, I would like to take your questions, if you have any. Please make use of the Q&A box at the top. And if you are a PA or SSE member and somebody I know, you're invited to raise your hand. Just keep in mind that this is being live streamed, and that function will put you on stage. So I'm going to continue to run my mouth and kill some time until I see a question. So Rex Stratton asks, is it possible to get a copy of your presentation or at least of a list of the material to read? This presentation will be on either or both of the PA and SSE YouTube channels within the week. In fact, it's being live streamed right there, so probably an hour from now you'll have access to this presentation. I don't know if you're asking for slides, but if you want slides, you can email me at Annalisa@parapsych.org, and I will be happy to present those to you personally. Let's see, is there anybody else? I'm gonna say going once, going twice. Oh, here we go. Can you talk about the relationship of the PA and Skeptic Society? Now, I will say I don't know which particular Skeptic Society. you are referring to. However, it is in our definition that we do not promote any particular belief or ideology other than the value of rigorous scientific study and scholarship. And membership in our association is open to skeptics, and indeed we do occasionally see some even career skeptics among our membership. So that's about all I can answer to that. I see another question. Where can we find resources about university-based education for parapsychology and edge science? At the PA website, there is a link literally called University-Based Educational Resources, and it lists all of the, it's a listing by country, and it lists all of the available courses or potential mentors or personnel that could help guide you through a PhD on a parapsychological topic, or there's also some links to courses such as the Intro to Parapsychology course at the University of Edinburgh, the Kessler Parapsychology Unit. And I'm going to ask that Ramses perhaps paste a link in the chat to that listing. Let's see. Would you please post the titles and authors of the books you suggested someplace where we can find them later? Sure, I can do that. I'll make a note of it. Anybody else have a question for me? John Kruth is asking, what made you want to study parapsychology? And oh boy, that's a complicated one. I was raised Catholic, and I was very, very much involved in the church, and I had a crisis of faith very young, 17, 18 years old. And that was actually kind of difficult because I was employed by the church to lead musical groups. And that kind of questioning, that crisis of faith, led me into two directions. One, I ended up getting a minor in comparative religion, so I started looking at all religious beliefs. And as I did that, I started to become interested in ideas of knowledge and power, and especially the seeming divide between science and religion. And I saw parapsychology as being an interesting intersection between the two. And as I looked more into the field, the more I sort of felt the calling to make that research better available and more accessible to people, because it was kind of a mystery to me why all of this really rigorous research was more or less publicly unknown. And I think I thought I saw a raised hand for a moment. Hopefully that answers your question, John. I look forward to seeing you later on today, because John will be giving a talk on subtle energies and PK. All right, I've got time for one more question if it pops up. Otherwise, let's see, that one's answered. Answered. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and end the session, and then we're going to make way for Christine Simmons-Moore's talk on ESP and psychology. So we'll see you again in a few minutes, and thank you very much.